right, so I've got the great honor to share this super interesting panel, which is titled The Reintegration Journeys of Individuals with Perceived ISIL Affiliation, Evidence from the Iraq Case Study. My name is Mimmi Söderberg Kovacs, and I'm with the Folke Bernadotte Academy, or FBA for short, in Sweden, the Swedish Government Agency for Peace, Security and Development. And FBA has been a sort of proud supporter of MEAC at sort of the outset of this. I'm also a little bit double-hatted, so I'll mention it because I'm also affiliated to Uppsala University as an associate professor in peace and conflict research. And I thought I'll open with saying something about a report that we turned in this very week from a project that we have been involved in the last 7 years, a big international research project, which we looked at sort of under what conditions can you resolve what we called Islamist armed conflicts. And this sort of whole question came out of a trend that we saw in the conflict data at Uppsala University that you might have seen, that we had this sort of increase of armed conflicts where you had actors within them that sort of self-defined as having an ideology based on political Islam. So the sort of the way that they framed the conflict, and I'm not saying that was all what the conflict was about or what all the actors was about, the dynamic, but there were actors within it. And we saw that this made a difference in terms of patterns and trends of how likely they were to be resolved. So as not only was there kind of an absolute increase in these types of conflicts after 2014 in particular, but there was also so that other conflicts were kind of going down. So other conflicts were being resolved in different ways or terminated, whereas these conflicts were kind of lingering and sort of proportionally becoming then the great bulk of armed conflicts. So today they constitute about half of the armed conflicts going on and about 70% of those that are most violent. So our question, where we sort of started out, was to say, what is that? What's going on with this? What's the case? What's the different dynamic? How can we possibly explain this? And we did quantitative study and qualitative studies and digging into some deep cases, including actually in Nigeria and in Iraq, but also many other cases. And two of the things that sort of came out, and I'm now simplifying long projects. I'm glad that none of my project participants are here. I'm sure they would protest. But I think two that I think is interesting. One had to do with sort of the transnational dimension of these conflicts. So what that does to the conflict. And we clearly also see this over time. So where the conflict logic perhaps was quite localized or like nationalized to begin with, but when the conflict became interlinked with or intertangled with a transnational dynamic, we saw that the possibilities for sort of de-escalation or for delinking this or finding peaceful way of resolving this conflict became much more complicated, really speaking to the prevention that we talked about yesterday before that happened. The other thing that sort of came out had to do with what it does with the reaction from the side of the government and the kind of tools available to the government, the support available to the government in terms of its allies, in terms of the counterinsurgency tactics, the counterterrorism frameworks, and how that sort of impacted the way that this conflict was perceived, making a bit of a link now over to this panel, and what it did to the kind of conflict dynamics. And those are the two of the most interesting things that came out of it. And in terms of, we did lots of studies looking at the differences between these non-state armed groups, depending on that ideology. And most of that came out, it's pretty much similar to other armed groups that we know in terms of how they behave, in terms of how they act, in terms of negotiation attempts and many other things. So it was rather sort of what happens and how's the reaction to these types of conflicts, including in our international approaches. So with that, I'm opening up to this interesting panel that we have in front of us. I'm also going to go and sit down. Hold on, I'm just going to find... So who's going to get started? Are we following the list in the actual program? Okay, I'm going to go and sit down first. Sorry, I'm going to have to flip this. Should I be sitting here? Maybe I should be sitting here. Right, so we have first Yousif, Khoshnaw. I apologize for the way I pronounce it, who has been part of the MEAC team.
Yep.
Yes, correct.
Okay, perfect.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon. My presentation would be precisely about the factors that affect the return and reintegration process for the families with perceived ISIL affiliation. Over the past 18 months, the MEAC project conducted many research on this. And today I will share 6 factors that affect the return and reintegration process. And then I will consider both families, those who never left Iraq and those who displaced to Syria and become residents in Al-Hul camp for a while. The 6 factors are perceived proximity to ISIL, the flow of information, social networks, conditions in Jadawan, and access to livelihood. There is one very important factor that is not listed here. There is one important factor that is not listed here, which is community acceptance, the two-way street factor. However, this would be addressed by my colleague Melisande. Next. Oops, sorry. Awesome, thank you. Perceived proximity to ISIL. Not all families face the same challenges when they make a decision to return from Al-Hul, Syria to Jadawan camp to Iraq and to their area of origin. We found that some families who are seen as particularly close to ISIL face bigger challenges than others. And to identify those families, we put together a set of indicators that were more likely to mean the person was perceived as close to ISIL. These indicators included if a relative or a family member sentenced or detained for terrorism, or if they had to disavow a family member or a relative accused for ISIL affiliation. People who viewed as close to ISIL were faced a bigger challenge to return and reintegration. For example, 22% of these people who were seen as close to ISIL had children with expired documentation, comparing to only 4% for the rest of the population. Also, they were more likely to experience discrimination in their community, and they were more likely to say they are always excluded from social gatherings. Flow of information. We look at how people access and use information in order to return from Syria to Iraq and Jada camp, then return to their area of origin. We found that most of the people rely on informal sources of information, like information from a friend or information from a family member. This means that people with weak social networks to Iraq find it very difficult to return or get information about the situation in the return area. So they are in a high significant disadvantage. They usually have nobody to connect them with like tribal leaders or security actors in the area or any community leaders to facilitate their return. On the other hand, the people with strong social networks have a wider range of information sources, and they were better equipped to make their decision to return. Female heads of households were disadvantaged twice because they typically had a weaker social ties. Also, they faced social norms that prevented them when they tried to approach male information brokers. Another finding about the flow of information is that Al-Hul returnees were more likely to trust the authorities who treated them with respect and dignity. There were also gaps and shortcomings from information sources. that sometimes encouraged rumors to emerge. For example, when a returnee got arrested during his return, and usually the case is not addressed by the Iraqi local authorities, which the other residents in the Jeddah 1 camp had to rely on their own unverified sources of information to interpret the case and know if the risk applying to them or not. But also there were some good practices in terms of flow of information. For example, there is a visitor center in Jeddah 1 camp that helps the residents to meet the people they know, their family members, their relatives. Also, the government provided the right for the residents to use mobile phones in an unrestricted way. Social networks. Another good factor that affect the return and reintegration. We found that people who were seen as close to ISIL had weaker social connections comparing to others. 28% of them had nobody to ask for a loan in an emergency situation. Also, the issue of social networks was especially important for Al-Hul returnees who are in Al-Jeddah camp. We surveyed some 223 people, and we found that the long-term residents had weaker social networks than former residents because they had nobody to receive information about the situation in a return area. Also, they faced very difficulties to find somebody who can provide them, support them with sponsorship in order to return. Okay. Another important finding about the social networks was families with perceived ISIL affiliations sometimes struggle to establish even social networks when they return in return areas. This is because of the fear of revenge and fear of discrimination in the return area that made them to get themselves isolated from the community and limit their movements as much as possible. Conditions in Jeddah 1 camp. Conditions in Jeddah 1 camp, especially the security environment, is very important factor that affects the reintegration and return. We talked with the people in Jeddah 1 camp. They were talking about the difficult times they had in Al-Hul camp, and the security environment is very different comparing to Al-Hul camp in Jeddah 1. And also we talked with service providers in Jeddah 1 camp. They provide information about the change in behaviors between the new arrivals in in Jeddah 1 camp and the people who arrived before a few months. Usually, this behaviors comes over the time for the residents in Jeddah 1 camp. It's not like ideological shift, but it's a change in habits due to the security to the security environment. For example, the former or the long-term the long-term residents not carrying any stones or any sharp tools for self-defense, comparing to the new arrivals in Jeddah 1 camp. Sorry, I'm going very quick, just about the time. Other factors, structural barriers like lack of accommodation, lack of livelihoods, and lack of civil documentation. Lack of civil documentation is the most important factor that affects the reintegration and that affects the reintegration and return. Over 50% of Jeddah camp said they still haven't returned in the camp, and they haven't returned because lack of documentation. And they know the stories of the people who returned without renewing civil documentation. They faced very difficult times in return areas, and they couldn't able to renew their civil documentation in return areas. Without civil documentation, people cannot go outside of their immediate areas for work, and children cannot go to school, which by the end would be difficult conditions for reintegration. Last factor is the access to livelihoods. I just want to focus on the impact of climate change and environment. That is very related to the climate change, since many returnees are going back to the areas that already affected by drought. This is an important factor because also it's a risk factor that make people to be vulnerable for future recruitment into armed groups. We interviewed over 2,000 people throughout many research, and we asked people if they know anyone or they heard of anyone who joined an armed group due to the change in weather. This question was part of the a group of questions related to the loss of livelihoods. As you see, like there is 29% of people said yes in Talafar, that people joined an armed group due to the change in weather. However, we didn't ask which armed group. This could be ISIL or PMF or any other armed group, but we know that ISIL has exploited the change in weather and climate change prior to 2014, and was able to recruit many people in the areas that affected by drought. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting. I think it's interesting. I mean, in a way, we have indirectly made some comparison between the cases, but in a way, you kind of see some things that come through in many cases. I think it's sort of interesting, some of the similarities. And one thing that I just wanted to highlight that came out in your presentation now, Yousif, but even more perhaps in the publications that come out of this, if you read it, is this notion of behavioral change, and not so much this sort of ideological change or change of sort of attitude, but changes in behavior and how much that matter for the different outcomes. I think that's a really interesting finding that sort of I would be interested to hear also how that plays out in other contexts. Thank you very much for this. And then we have also from the MEAC project, welcome up again, doctor now, right? I shouldn't, yes, Melisande Genat. Please, doctor, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, so I already spoke in the morning. So with IOM first, and then with MEAC again, I've had the opportunity to look at obstacles to return and reintegration faced by families with a perceived affiliation. And again, by this, I mean first-degree relatives of ISIS members, so fathers, spouses, children, and brothers, against whom there is no prosecution. And again, because the focus for international organizations at the moment is on the two camps, Jeddah and Al-Hol, I'll focus on Jeddah. And so here is a survey that was conducted by MEAC with 223 residents of Jeddah 1 camp, showing the main reasons why people had not returned yet to their area of origin. So obviously the first factor, the most important information here is that all of them, I mean most of them need civil documentation, and they were vaguely hoping to receive help from international organizations before leaving the camp and being on their own. So I already discussed this in the morning. Many families were also waiting for relatives to be allowed to leave Al-Hol camp and be repatriated to Jeddah camp, Jeddah 1. And also the process to obtain security clearance can take a little bit of time. So these are two immediate factors that can delay departure from the camp, but it actually says nothing of the actual obstacles faced by people in the communities once they leave the camp. Whether they go back to their area of origin or if they resettle in a new location. And most people, I mean, a lot of people I spoke to in Jeddah 1 camp, they told me that they would go to a different place. For reasons outlined here, for example, because their house was destroyed or taken. But also, and here I think the line, I faced community threats and rejection is actually as important as a factor, and it should actually come second, I think. And here the discrepancy comes, I think, from the methodology that's used to conduct surveys, where people don't necessarily open up unless you have them trust you first. And that can take a little bit of time. But really, more than half of the people I spoke to, they told me they had fears of threats or issues of fears of false or exaggerated accusation locally in their area of origin. And that brings us to community receptivity. Obviously, there exists a broad spectrum from complete rejection to relative acceptance of their return. And it really depends on a number of factors. In areas, so the sectarian makeup of the area of origin is important. In areas with a mixed population of Sunnis and Shias, return is usually more complicated. This is really the case in Tel Afar and in Yathrib, where I conducted research in 2021. And in Tel Afar, trust me, the situation should really be described as a silent, ongoing ethnic cleansing. I don't have time to give you the details, but if you're interested, you can reach out. I wrote reports on this with a lot of details. Then also you have a number, these are kind of isolated cases, but still, there are a number of zones or regions that are still completely closed, blocked by armed groups. The Popular Mobilization Forces in particular, you have Alja near Tikrit, you have Akashat near Qaim, and Jurf al-Sakhar, which is this big area. It's 120,000 people, mostly from the Janabi tribe. They cannot return. Elsewhere in Sunni areas, so it really depends on what has happened under ISIS, if massacres were perpetrated locally. And also, mostly it depends, and here this is almost as important as the civil documentation issue, because it goes completely under the radars, as well as it depends on whether or not a family with a perceived affiliation has personal or tribal disputes in their area of origin, whether these fears are justified or imagined. And revenge is often tied to what has happened, of course, under Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but very often, oftentimes, it can stem from more trivial or personal disputes, land, women, local power, and very often it's very difficult to separate all these factors. So what people do in the community when they are opposed to the return of a family, they make false or exaggerated accusations against this family. And very often, the houses or the land of an unwanted family have also been taken, most often by people who also lost their own houses and who might have victim relatives as a form of reparation. So it makes everything very complex. But so these accusations can be made either by secret informants, but this happens a lot less recently. So what people do, they're smart. They use loopholes. What they do is that they reach out directly to the counterterrorism services in Baghdad. And this is a huge issue because for publicity reasons, funding and politics, they are under pressure to arrest and convict as many people as possible. And what they do is that they do not coordinate with local security actors who usually know more or less what people have done. Counterterrorism services, they come at night, they make these arrests, and then it's extremely difficult get people out of jail. And so 2 categories are more at risk of these widespread accusations. Obviously, relatives of ISIS, anyone, brothers or sisters, it's very easy to say, oh, he or she also did something. But also there's another category that goes completely unnoticed, daily wage workers. Usually these are the poorest people in the community who could not afford paying a smuggler. They stayed under ISIS, and they worked for ISIS without pledging allegiance. For example, they transported water or food, they dug tunnels for a daily wage. And those who don't have personal or tribal issues in their community, usually because there is no prosecution against them, they have come back. Others live in constant fear. And this is typically not something that people will share with you during quantitative surveys. They will tell you likely that their house was taken, because also they expect some form of help from you. And I'll end, and this is an important point as well, which is that it's more broadly in Sunni areas at least, it's very difficult, it's impossible to talk about clear-cut categories of victims versus perpetrators, because most people who have lost relatives as well, I mean, they have at least cousins, but sometimes first-degree relatives as well, who have some form of affiliation, some degree of affiliation to ISIS. And it really depends on the position of power of these people in the community, the way they're being perceived. And this was very much the case in Al-Qaim, for example, where the families that were introduced to me as victim families, and they truly are victim families. All of them, turned out that they had relatives that they were trying to bring back from Al-Hol. And just unlike wealthier people in the community, they couldn't afford paying a smuggler $2,500. That's what it costs. It's the Kataib Hezbollah who's running the business. So if it's a family of 10, they cannot pay. But they were, mostly women and children that they were trying to bring back. And that brings us to the last point, to the idea that if the lines are so blurred, with time at least, room for reconciliation also increases. And this is something that I have personally noticed. When I started this research in 2020, most people I spoke to, they were very much, they rejected the idea that families with a perceived affiliation could return at all. Now, people, usually they express compassion, especially toward women and children whose fault they insist it is not if their men made the wrong choices. And also, something that I noticed is, so this huge state-led revenge campaign, people making false accusations, not giving them civil documentation, punishing all these women and children. Now people in the community who at first were saying, no, kill them, we don't want them back. Don't let them come back from Syria. Now they're telling me, this is a disaster. The way these people are women and children are being punished, this is going to backlash so bad in the future. So the community is aware that this huge campaign, revenge campaign that's happening is going to backlash. They are going to pay. For what's happening.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you. What I really like about this presentation specifically, but also many other presentations, is this, when you go out and really look at this in the sort of empirical details, it really sort of matters what you call it or what you label it, and it's so intertwined with so many other things. I recognize it a lot from the work that I've been doing on electoral violence, for example, that sort of, first of all, it becomes involved with local issues and revenge issues and family ties, and what we call electoral violence might be some other form of land dispute that sort of becomes interlinked with that sort of electoral dynamic. And I think it's very true in these sort of circumstances too, and understanding that context is super important. I think we now have a video message, I would say, from Ms. Aleksandra Lukasiewicz, Senior Protection Advisor, Northeast Syria, Save the Children. And
good morning, colleagues. My name is Aleksandra, and I'm a child protection advisor currently working in Northeast Syria. While I'm disappointed I wasn't able to join you all in person for the conference, it's my pleasure to be able to contribute to this very interesting and pressing discussion on the reintegration journeys of individuals with perceived ISIL affiliation. Working in the camps here in Nez, I'll provide a brief overview of what day-to-day life in detention camps like Al-Hol and Roj looks like. So to start, I'd like to mention some of the hardships that those living in Al-Hol and Roj faced. Conditions are alarming, with very limited access to basic needs, such as fresh and nutritious food, water points, and medical services. Wash facilities are in many cases dilapidated, with very little privacy, poor lighting, and are generally not gender segregated. Families live in tents, which provide very little protection from the elements, where temperatures in the winter drop below freezing, and intense sandstorms in the summer are common. Families are restricted in movement, including a schedule of when they can go to the market. Access to education for children is also limited, and largely only primary education is provided, and mostly by non-government organizations. Protection concerns are numerous, including the general lack of privacy, physical and gender-based violence between residents, as well as from law enforcement mechanisms such as the Asayish security forces, high numbers of aggressive dogs, and lack of access to basic services and specialized supports. For children, there are very few spaces for them to play and participate in normal activities that a child should. There are developmental delays due to the limited access to education and lack of supportive social environments. Young boys perceived to be over 12 are often arbitrarily removed from their mothers and sent to detention centers, which are more like prisons, where they live with no contact with their families. There are many indicators that extremist ISIL ideology continues within the camps, particularly in the Al-Hol annexes and Roj extension, where third country nationals are detained. These include simple persistence of very conservative practices, such as women wearing full niqab, separation of boys and girls, and restriction on certain activities seen as haram. More formally, these include Al-Hizbah committees, which have been appointed to oversee and monitor community morals and values in line with Sharia law, and are responsible to report on anyone seen in conflict with these. There are even reports that ad hoc Sharia courts have been set up, where those in conflict with Sharia law are tried and punished accordingly. Religion classes are popular in the camps, where leaders continue to radicalize and re-radicalize residents, including children of all ages. So as I touched on previously, violence continues to be a real threat in Al-Hol and Roj camps, both among residents and from authorities. Adults continue to act and encourage their children to act in violent and aggressive ways towards outsiders, throwing stones at organization vehicles and staff, encouraging dog attacks, and acting out in class and safe space settings. This cycle of violence is very difficult to break, especially when residents are in an environment that perpetuates it and promotes fear. Fear is in fact pervasive in the lives of residents in Al-Hol and Roj camps. Fear of the unknown, of what will become of their lives, fear of the very real threats they face on a daily basis, fear of what may await them in their home countries for those who are third country nationals, but also fear among outsiders, the international community, decision makers, security actors, and the public, for what effects reintegration of individuals with perceived ISIL affiliations may have. Thus, it is crucial that we look at how to break this cycle of violence and fear, at where the responsibility lies for solutions to this very real and troubling challenge, and at how we can uphold human rights accountability while balancing security concerns. So I'll end here by thanking you for allowing me to contribute to this discussion. I look forward to hearing about the outcomes and actions for this from the conference. And yeah, thank you so much.
All right. We kind of thank her, even though she can't hear us thanking her. But thank you very much for that. So we go to the next speaker on this, Dr. Anne Charbord, Senior Legal Advisor, Office of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights while Countering Terrorism.
Thank you. And let me start by thanking you, Siobhan, and the whole MEAC team for inviting the mandate of the Special Rapporteur to this meeting. So I've been asked to address briefly the situation of those who can't leave northeast Syria, and touch upon the broader humanitarian and security implications of the inability to return. So a lot of what I will say, I think, will be complementary to what we just heard from Aleksandra. And obviously, I approach the issues from the work that the mandate has done in northeast Syria, but also from the perspective of the mandate, which addresses situations that have been placed in the terrorism box. And hopefully at the end you might see why I put this up front. So I'm going to start by saying a few words about the humanitarian, human rights, and security situation in northeast Syria broadly, which is very different from many of the situations that we have been discussing over the last 3 days. And first, some figures, which many of you know. There are still about 65,000 individuals detained in northeast Syria. Of these, approximately 28,000 are Iraqi and 15,000 are third country nationals. Al-Hol and Raj, the two largest locked camps, hold approximately 55,000 individuals. There are 37,000 foreign nationals, of which 27,000 are Iraqi and 10,000 are third country nationals from approximately 60 different countries. In these camps, the large majority of the population, that's about 60%, are children, of which 80% are under the age of 12 and 30% are under the age of 5. In addition, there are approximately 10,000 men detained in northeast Syria, including up to 1,000 detainees who were apprehended as boys and who have since crossed the threshold into adulthood. Of these, approximately 5,000 are foreigners, 3,000 from Iraq, and 2,000 third country nationals. There are also 750 boys, again approximate numbers, that are detained either in prisons or in closed rehabilitation centers. So although all these figures are approximative, they are extremely high, given that these individuals have been detained for 4 years, and that we have just entered the 5th year of detention. Now, from a legal perspective, for the mandate that I represent today, as there is no legal basis for or review of the blanket indefinite detention of all of these individuals, these are arbitrary detentions that entirely lack in predictability and due process of law. The European Court of Human Rights, as some of you might have heard, has determined that the situation in the camps verges on a legal vacuum, that individuals are facing a real and immediate threat to their lives and physical well-being. The UK's Special Immigration Appeals Commission noted that the conditions in the camp are so bad that they meet the threshold of inhuman or degrading treatment. The UN Committee Against Torture has stated that the conditions of detention amount to inhuman and degrading treatment, and for the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the children in the camps face an immediate risk of death. Turning now to men and boys, they are held in situations that are indeed arbitrary detention, but they're also incommunicado detention. And in some cases, we should probably be speaking of enforced disappearances. And I'm referring here, for instance, to the case of an Australian teenager called Yousif Sahab, whose location or bodily remains have not been revealed to this day, 1 year, more than 1 year, after the attack on the prison in Hasaka where he disappeared. A court in Canada has just assessed that the conditions in the prisons are harsher than those in the camps. Correctly, the court said that they were even more dire than those in the camps. They noted the deplorable conditions of detention, the overcrowding, lack of health care and food, torture allegations, and the fact that men have not been seen or heard from since 2019. Access to the prisons is extremely restricted. It was already very limited, but it's now almost completely gone since the attack last January on Hasaka prison. So some repatriations have happened. Since 2019, we have approximately 36 countries who have accepted the return of about 6,500 of their citizens. And in recent months, the pace of repatriation has significantly stepped up. At the same time, it's clear that almost all of the returns, that's about 77%, have been of women and children. According to the figures that we have obtained, only 56 third country national men have been repatriated to just under 10 countries. So it's become very clear that there's a large population that will not be able to repatriate in the short to medium term, or that may never be able to repatriate. And it's also clear that a number of states are preparing for long detention periods, given that the current makeshift that Aleksandra has just described is being turned into modern, high-security bricks and mortar. Detention is becoming more entrenched, and it's carried out at the behest of states of nationality. So the people who won't be able to return include a broad range of individuals, some who will not want to return home, some who have been rendered stateless through the arbitrary deprivation of their citizenship, some who were born stateless because they can't prove their parents' citizenship, many who can't return due to non-refoulement concerns, and some who simply have been assessed as not apt to return or not chosen for repatriation, or not yet chosen for repatriations for reasons that they themselves simply don't know. And it also includes a number of men and boys who are simply not part of the repatriation, rehabilitation, reintegration trilogy, as well as an increasing number of boys, and Aleksandra referred to this, who have aged out of the repatriation circuit after having reached the age of 12 and who have been taken out of the camps and being put in these rehabilitation centers or these prisons, proving that boys in this conflict context are seen as threats. Upon reaching adolescence, they are not seen as victims, they are seen as threats. So it's clear that alternatives to repatriation are needed. And on this, I'll just make 2 points. I don't have a magic solution to the situation in Northeast Syria, but just 2 points. First, that the complexities of the political and the humanitarian landscape in Northeast Syria does not allow for easy solutions or quick fixes. Finding durable solutions will be a long-haul process for which the sequenced approach is going to be necessary. This will certainly include local integration, as well as potential resettlement to third countries, but it's pretty clear that this option will be very difficult to implement, given already the difficulties in obtaining the repatriation of countries accepting the repatriation of their own nationals. So as part of this sequenced approach, there's a need to find human rights compliant solutions for the most vulnerable population, and this of course includes children. But for this, more transparency is needed. We need to be able to identify and better understand the profiles of those who are not going to be able to return or not going to be able to return immediately. And this is a real challenge because there's very limited access to the camps and almost inexistent access to the prisons, and there's a lack of transparency of both states of nationality and of the de facto authorities in Northeast Syria. The second point I want to make on this is that humanitarian action cannot be a substitute to political solutions. Political will and the involvement of states that carry political weight is going to be critical. And I'm just going to finish on the question of assessment of threat. And I've been very pleased to hear over the past 3 days about the importance of evidence as part of this project, because in the field of terrorism and violent extremism, this remains a key gap. The mass arbitrary detention in this region is justified on the basis that it is a security imperative. It's the perceived or actual association with ISIL makes return, resettlement, or letting people go too risky. But let's be clear, apart from security assessments that have been carried out by some security agencies from a few countries, there remains very little knowledge about who the individuals who are detained in the camps and in the prisons are and what they may have done. In just one recent case from the UK, and this is the case of Shumaima Begum that I'm sure you've all heard about, shows that an interview given to a newspaper from the camps led a young woman to be vilified by public opinion, stripped of her citizenship. She's likely stateless at the moment, while in fact she had been groomed as a child, as the Special Immigration Appeal Commission recognized in a very recent case, and that it is likely that she was trafficked for the purposes of sexual exploitation by ISIL. So it's not good enough to rely on words like screening and assessment of populations, because they often carry a security or counterterrorism meaning, which is different from the one that is intended by human rights and humanitarian organizations. When unproven exhortations to an unspecified threat of terrorism caused by certain categories of individuals are clearly overly simplistic. They don't contribute to addressing the terrorism or complex violence. And if we fail to assess the security implications of long-term arbitrary detention and other human rights violations, we're missing a fundamental dimension of the real and tangible security threat that follows from the maintenance of Al-Hol, Raj, and other detention places in northeast Syria. So for those of you who are familiar with the work of the mandate, my conclusion is not going to come as a surprise. In northeast Syria, many of the frameworks that should apply, human rights law, the absolute prohibition of torture, the right to life, the right to education, many others, the right not to be rendered stateless, the law applicable to children, the frameworks relating to the recruitment and the use of children by non-state armed groups, the frameworks applicable to human trafficking are being completely displaced to address a threat, the threat of terrorism. And given the risks linked to sustained human rights violation, the geopolitical fluidity of the region, and the presence of designated groups, whether this is effective in countering terrorism or indeed building peace, should give us all pause for thought. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that important reminder, which also directly relates to many of the countries of us that are sitting in this room. And although it is very specific circumstances you talk about, there are elements of that particular discussion that I think relates to many of the other contexts in which we have talked about also. So with that, unfortunately, Juanita couldn't join us, so we have gladly, Abdelmoneim Mustafa has volunteered to be the discussant. He will also lead one of the workshops that will follow directly after this panel. So be glad to give some remarks. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, for having us here, and for UNIDIR, and I'm covering for UNITA, our colleague from UNICEF, Iraq. Thank you for panelists for the notes that you make. When we talk about ISIL families, we are dealing with a specific group, not the ones that we've been talking about during the last 3 days. We're not talking about fighters with guns. We're talking about families that just happen to be sons or wives or daughters of a fighter. The real fighters, perpetrators, either are killed or in jail or they fled the country. That's what make the condition very, very, very difficult. This also leads to what Dr. Anne has mentioned in her presentation. How do we deal with them as a security threat or from a humanitarian human rights point of view? And I think this is also has this issue has created even a problem within governments like Iraq. When they decided to bring those people back, you have the security forces, and they're pushing for them to be prosecuted. And you have the Ministry of Migration, they're pushing for them to be part of the normal IDP caseload, and that has also led to some problems that delay some of the return to Iraq recently. On the other side is, what about the victims? You know, we've been talking about ISIL families and returning them back, but victims has a say on that. And I remember in one of the activities that we do, we work to identify some of the beneficiaries. One person came and he said, "Can you count me as an ISIL?" At some point, it's not good to label yourself you are from ISIL, because that carries a lot of things. But because of the lot of attention that we have put on ISIL families as international community, so that's something also need to be addressed. Another thing that came in the discussion is the community acceptance, and a big chunk of that, it has to do with addressing the grievances of those families, addressing their concerns on rehabilitation. One main condition that has come up in all the meetings that we have with communities is we can accept those people, provided that, one, they get rehabilitated. What type of rehabilitation? Dr. Amara yesterday has spoken about, they're asking about psychological rehabilitation. But it's just something that we can do. It's something that it can bring some results. The other aspect is compensation. In Iraq law, they have a compensation law that's by which those who have been subject to terrorist attacks, they get individual sort of compensation. But that hasn't moved forward for many reasons. Committees are not enough, judges are not enough in those committees, there are delays in the processes. So part of it is also to move those kind of files, like compensation for people to accept ISIL families back in their communities. One final thing, we are talking about the formal return now. All the statistics that and the researches we have done and are about formal returns, that people came from Al-Hol, Syria to J1. We know the numbers. We take the numbers from the government. But there are big numbers that they're coming back to Iraq from Al-Hol informally. They're getting there, and they're also posing a security threat to people. We don't have the figures. We don't know how to reach them most of the time. You use local sources here and there, but that's also an area to look at. Finally, I will ask a question that's going to be discussed in the workshop later. How we connect what Dr. Anne has spoken about, the statistics that we heard about in J1, in Al-Hol, with what Melisande has spoken about in J1. So there is this gap. And if you look at the statistics and figures, you get different figures. I mean, if you go to the government, to some other source, you find different figures than what Dr. Anne has presented here. So there's also this gap that we're going to discuss more. Thank you very much, the panelists. Over to you.
Right, thank you very much. So join me in thanking the entire panel.